The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of early arrivals, lawyers reviewing notes, clerks tapping keys, and family members whispering about the defendant. Phones vibrated silently in pockets, and the fluorescent lights overhead hummed like background static. No one noticed the old man sitting in the very last row. Walter Dean, 84 years old, wore a pressed white shirt tucked neatly into brown slacks, and over it a faded olive sport coat with slightly frayed elbows. On his lap sat a khaki-colored military cap, its front patch barely visible after decades of wear. His shoes were polished, though the leather showed deep cracks, the kind only time could carve. Walter sat quietly, hands folded over the top of his cane, eyes fixed forward. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a witness, he wasn't related to anyone involved in the case. And yet, he was here, early, silent, alert. Most of the courtroom paid him no mind. A few people glanced his way, some with mild curiosity, others with indifference. A pair of younger men in suits whispered and chuckled, wondering aloud if he'd wandered in by mistake. Walter didn't react. He'd seen worse in his life, far worse. He shifted slightly, the cane creaking as he adjusted his grip and took a slow breath. His gaze wasn't focused on the defendant or the jury box or the audience around him. He was watching the bench, the judge's chair, empty for now. As the courtroom filled, a young clerk passed by and paused near his row. "Sir," she said, not unkindly but with impatience, "this area is for immediate family and legal teams." Walter gave a gentle nod. "I'll stay out of the way." She hesitated, then moved on without pressing the matter. There was something in his voice, a quiet authority beneath the calm. Minutes passed. Lawyers shuffled papers. Bailiffs checked the side doors. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, wrinkled envelope. He opened it and gently slid out a military commendation, a bronze star dulled with age. Tucked behind it, a folded letter on yellowing paper. He didn't read it. He knew every word by heart. He just held it in his lap and kept waiting. Outside the courthouse, life moved on in a blur of horns and city chatter. Inside, something quieter was building, something most people wouldn't notice, until it stood up and changed everything. And all the while, Walter Dean sat alone in the back row, exactly where he needed to be. The air inside the courtroom grew heavier as the minutes ticked by. People filed into their assigned rows, voices low, expressions guarded. The case on the docket was nothing extraordinary. Petty theft, repeat offender, minor but procedural. Still, for those involved, it meant something. For most of them, it was personal. For Walter Dean, it wasn't about the case at all. A young man in a hoodie brushed past his knees as he slid into the same row, casting a curious glance toward the old man's cane. Another muttered something about someone's grandpa showing up early. Quiet laughter followed. Walter didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, in languages they'd never understand. Up near the front, a public defender shuffled paperwork without looking back. A police officer leaned against the far wall, arms folded. The bailiff called for order, and a wave of rustling coats and shifting weight rolled through the courtroom like a silent tide. No one noticed Walter's eyes narrowing, locking once again on the still empty bench. He hadn't come here to observe a trial. He'd come for the man who would soon take that seat, the Honorable Judge Marcus Langford. Walter reached into his coat once more and drew out the yellowing letter. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was still steady, youthful, tentative in the way men write after surviving something they weren't sure they'd live through. It began simply, "To Sergeant Walter Dean, I don't know how to thank you. I should have died in that field. I remember you dragging me, half-conscious, over that hill while bullets split the air. I remember the blood, the dirt in your teeth, and how you never once let go." Walter stopped there. He didn't need to read the rest. He had memorized it decades ago. Back then, Marcus Langford hadn't been a judge. He had been a terrified second lieutenant in Echo Company, bleeding out in the mud with a fractured leg, screaming orders that no one heard, until Walter Dean carried him out of the fire and into history. They hadn't spoken in over 50 years, but Walter had followed his life from a distance. The law school, the bench, the decisions that shaped communities, and now this courtroom, this moment. "Excuse me, sir," a young woman whispered from beside him. "Are you waiting for someone?" Walter offered a quiet nod. "Yes." "Oh, I just thought you might be lost." "I'm not," he replied gently. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." She blinked, unsure how to respond, then offered a tight smile before turning away. The bailiff called the court to order. People rose. The clerk announced the entrance of the presiding judge. A door opened behind the bench, and Judge Marcus Langford entered. Clean black robe, salt and pepper hair, measured stride. He approached the bench with the weight of years behind him. As he settled into his seat, he scanned the room with trained efficiency until his gaze reached the back row and paused. Walter met his eyes. Neither man looked away. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but something was about to shift. Judge Marcus Langford adjusted his glasses, settled into his chair, and glanced down at the docket, but his mind was no longer on the case. His gaze kept drifting toward the back row, toward the man he hadn't seen in over 5 decades, Walter Dean. The courtroom droned on around him. Lawyers made introductions. Motions were filed. But to Judge Langford, the sound blurred beneath a memory from a jungle long gone. The last time he'd seen that face, it had been caked in dirt and blood under the deafening scream of gunfire. Walter had gripped his flak vest with iron hands, dragging him through waist-high grass while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Langford had been sure he was going to die. But Walter never let go. "Defense ready?" the bailiff asked. The judge snapped back to the present. "Yes. Proceed." The first witness had barely reached the stand when he raised a hand. "Actually," Langford said, voice steady but distant, Before we continue, I'd like to address the court." A murmur swept the room. Langford stood. "I see someone in this room today," he said, eyes scanning the audience, "who does not belong to this case, but whose presence is more significant than any ruling I might deliver today." He stepped down from the bench, unusual, unscripted, and completely silent. No one knew what was happening. Langford walked slowly to the aisle, his black robe swaying with each step. The bailiff took an instinctive step forward, then froze as the judge raised a hand. He walked toward the back row, toward Walter. And then, in front of the entire courtroom, Judge Marcus Langford stopped, turned, and brought his hand sharply to his forehead in a perfect salute. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The lawyers looked up from their notes. The defendant stopped fidgeting. The jury sat stunned. And Walter, still seated, looked up with steady eyes. He stood slowly, with the help of his cane, and returned the salute. 2 men, 2 generations. No words exchanged. Only the silence of a room holding its breath, and the weight of everything that gesture meant. Langford lowered his hand first. Then he spoke, voice quieter now. "This man saved my life in Vietnam. I was a second lieutenant, shot through the leg, panicking. He was a sergeant who refused to leave anyone behind. I've carried his name with me since that day, written in a letter I never sent. But he carried me, literally, across mud, fire, and death. Everything I am today, this bench, this robe, this courtroom, was made possible because Sergeant Walter Dean didn't let me die." The room was silent, not out of confusion, not out of protocol, but out of awe. Walter simply nodded. "I just did my job." Langford smiled through tears. "And I've spent a lifetime trying to live up to that." A beat passed. Then the bailiff, once stoic, offered a salute of his own. Then a young officer in uniform stood near the back, hand raised in reverence. And one by one, people in the courtroom stood, some with hands over their hearts, others with bowed heads. The defendant, barely 22, wiped his eyes. The clerk sat frozen, her fingers still on the keyboard. Langford turned back to Walter. "You deserve more than this, Sergeant." Walter looked around and replied softly, "I didn't come for more. I came to see if the man I saved became someone worth saving." Langford swallowed hard. "I hope I have." Walter smiled faintly. "You have, son. You have." After the salute, the courtroom remained still, eerily quiet, as if no one wanted to disturb the sacredness of what they'd just witnessed. Judge Marcus Langford turned back toward the bench, but his pace had changed. The authority was still there, but so was humility. Each step was grounded in something deeper than law: memory, gratitude, and reverence. Walter Dean slowly sat back down, his cane resting beside him. His face, so often still and unreadable, now carried the faint trace of peace. Not triumph, not pride, just quiet release. A burden had shifted. Back at the bench, Langford cleared his throat. "I believe this court needs a short recess," he said, his voice no longer wrapped in legal formality. "Let's all take a moment." He didn't wait for approval. He simply stood and walked out, passing Walter once more, this time placing a hand lightly on his shoulder as he did. Just a moment of touch. Nothing spoken. Everything said. As the judge disappeared through the side door, the courtroom stirred to life again. But differently than before. People didn't speak loudly. They didn't laugh. They moved slowly, as if leaving a memorial. Even the defense attorney, who had seemed bored 10 minutes ago, now approached Walter with tears in his eyes. "Sir, I didn't know who you were," he said softly. "But I do now. Thank you." Walter gave him a respectful nod. From behind, the court clerk, a young woman in her 20s, stepped forward, visibly shaken. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," she said, hands trembling around her tablet. "He never talked about it. But today, I think I understand something about him I never could before." Walter offered her a thin smile. Sometimes the silence speaks louder than the story. Others followed. One of the jurors shook Walter's hand firmly. A teenager who had come to observe the trial for a school project whispered to her teacher, "He's a real hero, isn't he?" The teacher replied, "The kind you usually never notice." Near the courtroom door, the young defendant, who'd been standing trial only minutes before, hesitated. He turned back, walked over to Walter, and stood awkwardly. "I messed up," he said quietly. "But if a man like you thinks this judge is worth something, then maybe I still have time to be someone too." Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Start today." The boy looked like he'd been handed a second chance by someone who had once fought for far more than courtrooms and verdicts. By the time Judge Langford returned, the room had transformed. It no longer felt like a space for sentencing. It felt like a space for restoration. The judge retook his seat, composed but changed. "Let the record reflect," he said, glancing briefly at Walter, "that we're all witnesses today, not just to law, but to legacy." He struck the gavel once, softly, reverently, and the proceedings continued. But no one would remember the case that was tried that day. They would remember the man in the back row, the one who didn't come for justice, but gave it meaning. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, not because the session had ended, but because no one wanted to leave. Walter Dean remained seated a while longer. No cameras flashed, no applause, just a few lingering glances from those who now understood who he was and what his presence meant. As the last few people filed out, Judge Langford stepped down from the bench and walked toward him. No black robe now, just a man in a plain gray suit with eyes that carried both power and regret. They stood in the center of the courtroom, the judge who had nearly died as a boy, and the soldier who had refused to let him. Langford reached into his pocket and pulled out something Walter hadn't seen in years, the original letter, folded, fragile, but kept. "I never sent it," Langford said. "I didn't think it was enough." Walter looked at it, then back at him. "You lived your life right. That was enough." A long silence passed between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Langford finally smiled. "Would you have lunch with me?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "You buying?" Langford chuckled. "It's the least I could do." They walked out together, side by side. No escort, no crowd. Just two men leaving behind a room that would never forget what had happened within its walls. Outside the courthouse, the sun was soft on the concrete. A gentle breeze stirred the flag above the entrance. Walter paused to look at it, then at Langford. "You ever think," Walter said, "about how many lives we cross without knowing what they carry?" Langford nodded. "I do now."